Welcome everyone. Myself, Dr. Praveen Kumar Pathak. I am working as an associate professor in the Department of Geography at Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi. Today, I am going to talk with all of you a very important topic, which is migration transition. As you all know, that in the modern times, there are two important global factors that explain important global changes. First is, of course, technological innovations, and second is demographic changes. If you look at demographic changes, there are three important components which are responsible for demographic change in the global world. First is, of course, mortality transition, followed by fertility transition, and finally migration transition. If you look at fertility and mortality transition, they are very different if you compare from migration. Part of the reason is that it takes relatively longer period of time for any country or any society to experience mortality and fertility transition. On the other hand, if you look at migration, it's very different in terms of its impact on the global population dynamics, because migration changes can happen very suddenly, and they may have tremendous impact on local level, regional level, and of course at the global level. So with this background in mind, I thought that today we will discuss about migration transition. Now, there is a very noted philosopher and mathematician called B. Pascal, and he said very categorically and why migration is important. So he said that the sole cause of humans' unhappiness is the fact that he does not know to sit quietly in his room, by B. Pascal. So the idea is that by nature, human beings are looking for better future. And therefore what happens? People often tend to move in search for better livelihood opportunity to improve their individual and familial circumstances. But many times there are some other factors also which do play a significant role when people have to decide when and where they want to move. And often these causes can be different, ranging from economic stress at the place of origin. It could be social and political stress at the place of origin. It could also be potential better opportunities at the place of destination. And recently, due to increasing human activity in the era of Anthropocene, the climate change have also led to a lot of mass movement of human population. And so therefore, if you look at global level, today close to 80 million people are being added to the world population on annual basis, and most of this population increase has been observed in the case of low and middle income countries, where we observe that the population age structure is very young and we have a huge youth bulge in the population. And therefore what we have is limited economic and livelihood opportunities for young people who are living in developing economies. And so briefly, I would just like to discuss with you that how demographic transition has happened in the global population and how that is related to migration transition. So if you think about migration transition, and if you look at the historical perspective, so we have seen that human population has been mobile since historical time periods, and most of this migration was largely restricted between small villages, between rural to rural areas, and there were hardly any cities in the past. So essentially the migration that used to happen in the historical time frame was restricted between villages of different sizes in different parts of the world. Take for example the case of Aboriginal population in the Americas, which migrated out of Asia. Similarly, evidences also shows that a lot of European population, essentially who were actually farmers and they were not living largely in cities, who chose to migrate out of Europe and they moved to Americas. So in historical time periods, we have observed that these people tend to move from smaller villages to relatively bigger villages in terms of livelihood opportunities to make better circumstances for their families and for the society. However, if you look at the history in the European context, soon after this migration we observed that there was a mortality transition which happened in Europe, you know, and so therefore, because of this mortality transition, what happened is that at the base of the population pyramid, you had relatively, bulge that started to happen. Why? Because the young children started to live longer, and so gradually, because of this bulge, you have more number of population at the initial young ages, and therefore when this bulge moved up at the younger ages, there was a huge pressure that was felt in the population, and most of this population was living in the rural areas. And so therefore, when this rural population started to increase, it led to a lot of stress on economic prospects in the rural economies. And on the other hand, in the case of the cities, the cities emerged as a strong center of opportunities due to changing economic structure in the urban areas. So what happened when this mortality started to decline and fertility levels rather remained high and stagnated? There was a brief period of time when there was a huge increase in the world population number. Of course, I'm talking about 15th and 16th century and 17th century of Europe, and this was the time when population number in the Europe was rising. And then what happens that these urban settlements, these cities gradually became the center of power, the center of control, wherein rural people had to move for better opportunity because of the increasing population pressure being felt in the rural areas. And because this population number was rising, there was a huge problem of food insecurity in case of these rural areas. And so therefore, gradually, for the rural community to survive, traditional agriculture did not remain as a very significant livelihood option, and therefore the traditional agriculture had to give way for mechanization of agriculture, and so that the food production may be increased and the population could survive. On the other hand, because of mechanization, industrialization, urban settlements started to emerge as the major center of prosperity and opportunity. So thus we understand that historically these cities have emerged as important player of human advancement. Now, if you look at these, this is what, if you look at the human transition, from historical time periods, migration was largely affair between rural to rural areas, and this number, if you look at the absolute size of this migration number, that was very small as compared to the recent phenomena wherein, because of rapid population increase due to mortality decline, a lot of people have started to move from the rural to urban areas. So this has become a new phenomena of human migration transition, wherein now large number of people are moving from rural to urban areas, partly because they are trying to find better opportunities for themselves and their families. So basically, if you look at the migration transition, I think if you look at this migration transition, there are two things which are important for us to note. First is that of course there is an increase in the fraction of human population who migrate, and second is that there is also a shift in the place to which and from which the people are migrating. So if you remember the first point, which is increase in the fraction of people who are migrating, and if you just take a second and think about this, so the point is that in historical time periods where the opportunities were largely agriculture based in the rural areas, people were essentially moving from smaller villages to large villages, nearby villages, in search for some opportunities, agriculture and allied activities. But as I told you, as agriculture gradually gave way for mechanization, for industrialization, and as cities started to gain prominence, there was a shift in the pattern of human migration, and then gradually it started to take place from rural to urban cities and center. And if you take case of in India, it's very much apparent that initially this this migration happens from between smaller villages, and then gradually people try to understand and find out more opportunities. They move from smaller cities and towns to bigger cities and towns, and this is what demographers and human geographers have said, that migration tends to be a stepwise process. So very rarely you would find that somebody from a remote village in a part of UP called Jaunpur would like to directly come to maybe Delhi or Mumbai. Rather, they tend to first go to nearby places, maybe Varanasi or Lucknow, and then after gaining some specialization, improving their technological know-how, would then take a next step and go to maybe bigger cities in the country. And even if they find that now they have got technical skills, they may even explore better opportunity for themselves and their families abroad. So this way, traditionally we understand that migration is a stepwise process. The second point is, of course, there is always a shift in the places. So the point is that the geography matters. So people tend to move from areas where opportunities are there, and as economy changes, the structure of economy changes, the opportunity changes, people tend to move to better places where there are new opportunities, and therefore this technological innovation is very critical. Cities, and particularly bigger cities, the million cities, the megalopolis, whether it is Delhi, Mumbai, New York, the bigger cities in the world which have diversified economic functions, they are the major magnet where people tend to find greater opportunities, are attracted to migrate. But again, as you also know, that when the process of urbanization unfolds, the city also undergo a lot of changes and transformation, and we have also seen that there is a issue of urban decay. Many cities, because of technological innovations, they lose in the competitive process of economic progress. So traditionally, for example, cities such as Detroit, even in case of India, for example, Kolkata, which could not sustain with the technological progress, and they were not able to update themselves. So for example, in Detroit, which was essentially a city which was famous for production of vehicles and motors and other things, and as the demand changed, and it was not able to keep pace with the changing time, and so therefore those cities have given way to other cities which have diversified themselves, updated themselves with the contemporary technologies, and so correspondingly the stream of migration also has changed. So therefore, thinking about this migration transition, I think this two key points must be taken note. One is, of course, the absolute size of the population and the stream of migration in historical time period, which was between rural to rural. Now it has changed from rural to urban, and as economies develop, like today, if you talk about India 2023, we know that more than 50 cities in the country are million plus cities. So there are a lot of centers of innovation, growth, prosperity, and now people have got more option to migrate, internal migration in the country. And similarly, globally also, when you talk about international migration, the power of economic center is now shifting towards the east. And so a lot of people are now migrating not only to Europe and America, but alternative places. For example, Middle East has traditionally been an important center of economic growth and business and tourism, where people tend to find a lot of economic opportunities. And therefore, China is another very important example where with rapid industrialization and economic growth, it has created a lot of opportunities for jobs. And even in case of the East Asian countries, be it Korea, be it Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, they have advanced industrially and economically very fast in the last 30 to 40 years, and therefore creating opportunities. But of course, these opportunities are very much technical and skill oriented. So wherever these labor force are there, they can of course go and exploit these opportunities. So therefore, for a geography student and people who are working in social sciences, it is important to recognize this fact, that these places, these settlements which are essentially multifunctional, are critical places where opportunity exists. And in today's time, you would really find people migrating for agriculture reasons, where there are hardly any place left on this planet where somebody is migrating to look for new place for agriculture, because largely today the global population has crossed 50% mark. Basically they are living in urban settlements. So as if you look at in America and Europe, where more than 80 to 85% people live in urban settlement, so gradually in the case of global south as well, we are witnessing that this migration is largely towards cities, urban settlements that tend to provide opportunities for skill building, opportunities for better livelihood opportunities, and of course they are great center of medical and entertainment and new culture. So therefore it's very important for us to understand that how over time these migration tend to shift from one place to another depending upon their economic progress. Now, talking about the relationship between migration transition and demographic transition. So as I said, that the control of these, both mortality and fertility historically has largely existed in urban places. So what happened if you go to previous works on demographic transition in different part of this world, we have always witnessed that this has largely started basically in urban centers. Why? Because largely these urban centers have been the center of knowledge, innovations, whether it is advancement in medical technologies, vaccination, water and sanitation. So all these new innovations have first taken place in urban center. So whether it's in Europe, in America, also in case of global south, and then later these innovative behavior they diffuse to the nearby rural areas. And same is the case in case of migration. When this rapid population growth has happened due to mortality decline in the rural areas, there was this situation happen where you had suddenly a lot of people who are working in agriculture, and they need to be replaced by machines in order to ensure the food security, as I think I have discussed few minutes back. So you had these people who are working in agriculture, they have become redundant because the economic productivity was not positive, and therefore this mechanization and industrialization led to greater opportunities for people to come to cities. And so therefore we have a very direct relationship between demographic transition and migration transition, wherein because of rapid increase in the population in the young age group because of mortality decline, you had a lot of people in the rural areas without opportunities of production, of livelihood, and then people shifted from rural areas to urban areas for better opportunities. So this migration transition within country may also be understood as a story of population growth in the rural areas, leading to redundancy of people working in the rural areas. So therefore causing people to look elsewhere for a livelihood. So many times rapid population growth in the global south has led to a lot of crisis of livelihood in these rural areas. And so therefore we can understand that essentially this migration transition is nothing but an urban transition. So coming to some conceptual issues, how can we define migration? And of course that is not easy. I mean there's a lot of variation in terms of how can we define migration. But according to United Nations and the globally accepted definitions, we understand that migration is essentially involve a spatial movement which has to be permanent in nature. So there is a long-term resettlement of the human population. So there has to be a permanent shift in the usual place of residence. So if you look at this definition, it says that there has to be detachment from the organization of activities at one place and the movement of the total round of activities to another. So in some sense we may also interpret it as there has to be change of social milieu, your social web of relationship from place A to place B. And if that happens, it may be understood as human migration. So let's take for example somebody who is living and working in a city called Delhi for some period of time, and if he or she has got a better opportunity in some other place, for example Dharamshala, and if he or she is moving to the new place on permanent basis or long-term basis, means that he or she is actually changing his entire social milieu. So this means this can be taken as a case of human migration. Now on the other hand, if suppose somebody is living in Delhi and northern part of Delhi is moving to southern part of Delhi or within city migration, so that does not essentially involve change in the social milieu. Or even if you are changing in the same society, house from one block to the other, so that essentially doesn't involve change in your social milieu. So therefore that may not be considered essentially as human migration. There are some these are nothing but forms of mobilities. So for example, if you are moving in one part of the city from north to south, or even if a lot of people commute for day-to-day basis from one city to other city, or for example a lot of people commute to Mumbai, at least they take outskirt of Mumbai or Thane, or maybe further far away. So they are commuting on daily basis. A lot of people are coming to Delhi for work purpose, and they are commuting maybe from Meerut, people coming from Agra, or even people coming from Lucknow to work in Delhi, and again they go back the same day or maybe the next day. A lot of people now are taking air flights and moving between Delhi and Mumbai for their work purposes. So these kinds of travel, which involves short-term movement for business purposes, economic purposes, maybe for treatment purposes, this is a form of mobility where people are commuting for specific reason in a specific time frame, but this does not essentially involve the permanent shift in the social milieu, and so therefore this may not be considered as migration. So therefore migration can only be considered if it really involves a permanent shift in the place of your place of residence, and if that is not a case, it may be considered as mobility but not as migration. There are also other forms of mobility, for example transhumance, wherein the tribal communities tend to move in different parts for their animal grazing, taking their livestock with them. So these kinds of seasonal movement may also not be considered essentially as migration, because this again does not involve the permanent shift in the place of their residence. Yes. So in simple terms, if we have to understand what this migration refers to, so it usually defined as a geographical movement of people involving a change from their usual place of residence. And therefore human migration is the movement of people from one place to another place with the intention of settling permanently in the new location. But it is distinguished from other different forms which may be temporary or very short distance movements, and such kind of movements is often short term, and so therefore they may be considered as some form of mobility but not as migration. Now talking about migration, there are some important basic concepts which we often come across, and let's start with immigration and emigration. So these are two important terms which are actually related to international migration. One is immigration, 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 which means that persons from, say for example, from UK, if moving to Delhi, so he or she will be considered as immigrant to India at the place of destination. But he or she in UK will be recorded as emigrant, emigrant, for UK. So it depends on the place of origin and at the place of destination. Correct? So somebody who is so basically international migration requires that somebody has to cross the international border through, of course, legal means, through visa and passport, and so that will be international migration. But then at the place of origin, he or she will be recorded as an emigrant of UK, and he or she will be immigrant to India, right? So these two are important distinctions that we have to be clear about. Then if you talk about the internal migration, of course, in a large country, for example India, we know that there is a lot of regional diversity in the country because of economic, geographic, cultural nature, and so therefore census provides us the various kind of questions that through which we can measure the volume and the streams of migration. So the in migration means migration occurring within an area, while out migration means migration from the state to other state. So both type of migration are called internal migration with this country. So for example, if you read here, migration from Bihar to Bengal is in migration for Bengal, and it is out migration for Bihar. So it depends on the place of origin and the place of destination. And similarly, because of these regional differences in terms of economic status and demographic composition, these migrations are a regular phenomena in various parts of the world, including India.